What I can tell you is that we're not giving up until the checkered flag in Abu Dhabi. What made the W13 so competitive this weekend? I think there's a few factors that came together at the same time. The first is that we put a large update kit on in Austin, and that did move us forward, and that evidence was even more present really in Mexico. The second is that we are very good when we're running maximum downforce, and others are running maximum downforce as well. And that was evident in Zandvoort, in Budapest, for example. And it was no different in Mexico. In Mexico, everyone really was running their maximum rear wing, the maximum amount of downforce that they can get away with. I think also Austin being a very tricky, windy, conditioned race meant that perhaps we didn't see the full extent of the performance update, whereas in Mexico there was no real wind to speak of. We have a car now that seems to be balanced and is working well. How it will perform across the next two is hard to tell. Obviously, in the case of Mexico, it looked a little bit like Ferrari actually dropped back, and I suspect that won't be the case as we move forwards. What's the most important thing to consider while racing at altitude? Really, it's cooling, be it the brakes or the power unit. To give you an example of that, you would have seen clouds of dust at times coming out of the wheels when they're braking into turn one, and that's really high wear on the brake discs, and there's only a certain amount of that you can do before you have a failure. The other one is power unit. The power unit struggles in terms of cooling. You would have seen us running really the maximum amount of cooling that we have available to us, as others did as well, in order to keep the temperatures under control. The other element is, of course, that the power unit at those altitudes is not quite producing the same power as it would at sea level. So to explain why that is, at sea level, which is where most of our races are, you are still having 21% oxygen, but the difference to 2,200 meters, where it's still 21% oxygen, is the air is much less dense, basically about a quarter in terms of where we stand. So you're about 760 millibars ISO at Mexico. Here in the UK, somewhere around 1,000, 1,020, so a large difference. And what that means is, if you consider it as a human, for every breath you take, really you're bringing in 25% less than where you would at sea level, and the power unit's no different. It takes a lot of work in order to get everything working seamlessly in Mexico, and it's also why you tend to see a lot more stoppages during the course of the race weekend as you would at other tracks. Was the new front wing used, and if so, did it show any improvement? Yes, and yes is the answer to that one. So we fitted it on Friday. In a modified form, you would have seen some level of discussion over what we had initially. It was in a slightly modified form, but otherwise was fitted to the car and performed, as far as we can tell through our metrics. We measure pressure tappings on the car and loads at various locations. It was performing and remained on the car for the remainder of the weekend. Why did you not go longer on the medium tyres and then fit soft? It's a very good question, and one that we're reviewing here internally this week, as we do with all of our decisions during the race. Let's break it down. With Lewis, first of all, he was in a position where Perez had stopped, and we only had a lap to cover him, really, a lap or two. We had two choices. Let Perez effectively undercut us, but go long and then fit the soft tyres, or stop. And given the length of stint, the hard would have been really the tyre that could have made it. The soft would not have made that level of stint. We decided that track position was more important at that stage, and furthermore we had some data from Latifi that had already stopped, and the hard wasn't terrible. So we opted to stop, put Lewis on the hard tyre and go towards the end of the race, under the hope that potentially Verstappen was going to drop off that medium curve, much as we started to see degradation at the end of our stint. With George, there was a lot more opportunity to really keep going long and fit the soft tyre, and that was the plan. It was what we had discussed before the race, and it's what we discussed live during the race with George as well. We carried on the stint, and what we could see is that actually relative to Perez and Lewis, George was starting to lose a lot of time. That medium tyre really just struggling at the end of its degradation stint. You would have heard George come on and really start to give us indications of that as well. The question now was, given we were struggling on a medium tyre after just 30 odd laps, would the soft tyre really make the stint required? It was a hard choice, but we decided on balance, stopping and fitting the hard tyre will probably bring us a better result, in the belief that if we're struggling on the medium tyre here, Perez probably won't make it to the end of the race and may need to stop one more time. That, in hindsight, was the wrong decision. I think when you look back and you look at Ricciardo, we should have just kept going. Yes, there was degradation and it was getting more and more, but we wouldn't have to have gone much further before we can fit the soft tyre. What the result would have been, I'm not sure, but I think it would have been a better race than what we did. What were the engine cuts Lewis was experiencing during the race? You would have also heard those comments from qualifying as well, so let me try and explain what was going on. We were suffering a little bit with engine cuts, and here's the reason why. You generally map the engine for the conditions it's most used in, which is sea level. That's where most of the racing takes place. When you suddenly go to this level of altitude, you're in a very different condition. And instead of having an engine that's really highly tuned, you're back into a condition where you have to do lots of work with the power unit in a very short space of time to try and map out these irregularities. I'm confident all teams will suffer with this. It won't be unique to ourselves. It's typically accentuated in qualifying because you're very quickly and rapidly applying throttle pedal, which means that the turbo and fueling systems need to keep up with that change very quickly. And normally it's better in the race. We were hoping that the race would not be as bad. And it comes from a factor of when the drivers requesting throttle and picking up throttle were simply not delivering the power they request quick enough, so enough fueling or enough air. It can be tuned out in time, and where we got to in the race wasn't a bad position. I think qualifying was worse, but still enough to cause a small amount of performance loss for both drivers. Why didn't you split the cars at the start of the race or at the pit stops in order to go more aggressive? So first of all, I'll pick up the term aggressive. By starting on the medium, which is a big difference relative to both Ferrari and Red Bull, that is sort of aggressive in many forms because you're doing something very different to them. We believe that Red Bull would be a faster race car, so doing exactly the same thing as they're doing probably won't lead to a race win. But starting in the medium, if the soft degrades more than we're expecting to, or the medium degrades more than you expect it to, so a one-stop's just simply not possible anymore, that now means the medium-hard one-stop creates an opportunity that wouldn't have been there otherwise. As for why we didn't split them on the grid, we had two cars in a strong position and felt that actually we could weaken ourselves by splitting them. As it was, it probably would have been George on the soft. And who knows whether he would have kept that position or not. But had he dropped back, having a car on soft behind one on medium creates complications. The next element of it is why didn't we split them later on, which is a question I've covered off. We should have. I think George should have been on the soft. What it would change, I'm not sure at this state. What I can say though is rewind the race, what would we do differently? We wouldn't split them, but we would have started both on soft. I don't think it would have made a dramatic difference to where Lewis was. He would have finished second. But George definitely lost out at the start of the race, and I think the extra grip may have just helped him hold on to positions there. So a second or third may have been possible, and we definitely would have been closer to Verstappen on how we were racing. How big is the performance gap to the front now? I think this will really vary track on track. Ferrari won't be that far back and away from us as they were in Mexico. They will be closer in Brazil and in Abu Dhabi, and it'll be a very close fight between our two teams. In terms of relative to Red Bull, they still hold the edge relative to us. I don't think it's quite the 3/10 they outqualified us by, but it'll be a few tenths across the next few races. We are getting closer and closer. Compare where we were to the beginning of the season, where at times we were struggling to get out of Q1 or into Q3, to where we are now, which is we are within a whisker of fighting for our first win. We have moved forward. In Brazil, it's a track that both of our drivers have typically gone well at. And there's a sprint race where we can pick up more points. And when you have a car within a few tenths of your competition, you can make things happen. Due to Brazil's higher altitude relative to most circuits, do you think you'll be as competitive there as you were during the Mexican Grand Prix? It's really hard to tell before we go into an event, but I don't think we'll quite enjoy the same level of competitiveness. It won't be much different, but it might be a slight step backwards, and I certainly expect Ferrari to be closer than they were in Mexico. Yes, it's higher altitude than normal. I think it's around 700 meters compared to sea level, but it's also a factor of what the track layout is and what downforce level people are at. As mentioned previously, we really function well in these high downforce circuits, and that's not what we have coming up in Brazil. With the way the team raced in Mexico, is the team confident that they can take second in the constructors from Ferrari? As mentioned previously, it's very clear what our internal goal is. We're here to finish second in the championship, and every single race that we can start pulling that points gap down is a success. In Mexico, we took just 13 points out of them, so there's still 40 left to go with two races. Fortunately, one of those is a sprint race. I think we have a package now, unlike at the beginning of the season or the mid-season, that can really bring the fight to them. But 40 points is a tremendous ask. It will need us really having everything perfect, everything right, and Ferrari perhaps to give us opportunities to open the door for us to pick up second. What I can tell you is that we're not giving up until the checkered flag in Abu Dhabi. Thank you for all of your questions, and we'll be back in 2 weeks after the Brazilian Grand Prix.